Good afternoon to folks who are gradually streaming in from the waiting room. We now know that this does take a couple of minutes for us to get everybody into the Zoom. So I'm just going to say a few words here while we get folks in. All right. Good afternoon from Washington, D.C., and good evening to the Goldberg-Polin family in Israel. This is an incredibly meaningful webinar for J Street and for all of us in the J Street community. It's 34 days, as we can see from Rachel's number. We know about your number from your interviews on the media. It's 34 days since the horrific attack of October 7th. And for all of us at J Street, our hearts continue to break and to grieve with you and all the families of the held hostages. So many of us have been personally affected. I have staff who lost family on October 7th. We have many friends who live in the communities that were affected. Obviously, many of our friends' kids at the music festival. And it just goes on and on and on. And the anguish and the loss, the grief is overwhelming. And we want to take this hour to talk about the hostage situation and what can be done, and hear a little bit from the families. Also, we're going to be hearing later on from Dr. Gershon Baskin, who has real insights into this kind of a situation, having been involved in the negotiations to secure the release of Israelis in the past. We're really honored to be joined for the next few minutes by Rachel Goldberg and Jonathan Polin, who are the parents of Hersh Goldberg-Polin, who was abducted by Hamas on October 7th. And I have to say to the two of you that, within hours of these tragic events happening, my phone, email, WhatsApp, everything started going. And because of the connections that I have and that we have with the State Department and other places, everybody was trying to see what can we do to help. The number of people who called on behalf of Hersh, your heart should just be so warm knowing how many people he has touched, and the level of love and friendship that is out there in 1 degree of separation. And the picture froze for a second, but you're back with us. The degree of love in our community for Hersh and for your family, I can't begin to express. And so Rachel, who is Hersh's mom, is a dual Israeli-U.S. Citizen, and Hersh was celebrating his 23rd birthday at the Supernova Music Festival. You've been on a lot of media telling the story of his abduction and the injuries, and you've advocated every single day since he was captured for the humanitarian treatment of him and the rest of the hostages and for their release. And I just can't thank you enough for all you're doing. Would you be willing to just share with us a little bit about Hersh and about the situation in your own terms, and tell a little bit of your story for the J Street community?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having us. And I apologize to everyone that we are stuck in this taxi. We were rushing around from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting, as is our, life now. And we got trapped in Tel Aviv traffic. So, but I'll start by saying, if you want me to tell you a little bit about Hersh before October 6th, I'm happy to. Hersh is our eldest child, our only son. He is, of course, as every mother, and especially Jewish mother, says, he's wonderful. He is a curious, gentle person who's very respectful. John and I keep going over how he is like a lovely, respectful person of all peoples, likes to listen to different people's ideas. He's a voracious reader, loves to travel, has been obsessed with geography since he's a little boy. I was actually remembering that he signed up as a very little boy he asked us for a subscription to National Geographic, and they had the little kid National Geographic. And by the time he was in third grade, he said, like, this is beneath me. I need the real National Geographic. He loved this summer when he was traveling, he went to a lot of music festivals in Europe by himself for 9 weeks. He went to 6 different countries. And that's what drew him to the Nova Music Festival of Unity and Light, which he went to with his one of his he's in a trio of best friends. He went with one of the other boys on Hersh era. And I mean, I think most of you have probably heard this story that Saturday morning, this massacre. That's okay. We almost just died. We heard about this massacre that was happening in the music festival, and ended up finding out that Hersh and Aner escaped to a roadside bomb shelter where Hamas descended upon the shelter, threw in hand grenades, fired an RPG, sprayed this tiny room of 29, music lover young people with machine gun fire. And when all was said and done, most of those young people were dead. Many were in the process of dying. And some of the lucky ones were trapped underneath the bodies of the dead people. And it's from those eyewitnesses that we heard that Hersh and 2 other young men were ordered by gunpoint to stand up. That's when they saw that Hersh's left arm below the elbow had been blown off at some point during the fire. And they were taken and put on a Hamas pickup truck, which headed toward Gaza. His last phone cell signal was detected inside of Gaza at 10:25 in the morning on October 7th. And then subsequently, we did get video of the actual abduction from Anderson Cooper, who had found it when he was coming across. He was researching for a CNN documentary that he did about the music festival. So we have seen Hersh getting onto that truck, turning to sit down, and then we see his injury, that he no longer has a left hand. And that's the last, that we have had any, that we saw him visually, on the video. And the last communication we had was at 8:11 in the morning on Shabbat morning of October 7th. He had sent us in a row one text that said, "I love you," and the next one said, "I'm sorry," which, what I actually was thinking about it today, that he must have thought, he didn't record to us. A lot of the families that we've spoken to have recordings of their kids, screaming to them, or they called them. And I was thinking how interesting it is that he must have known. I don't know if he thought he was dying. I don't know. But that he didn't record to us, that he actually wrote those things to us, I think is really interesting.
We also have no way of knowing whether he sent the messages at 8:11 or sent them earlier, but because there was spotty cell coverage, they came at 8:11.
Right.
But
Either way.
it makes a difference, because we now know that by 7:30-ish, they had already come under heavy gunfire. So we don't know how much of that he had already experienced by 8:11. But it was likely some serious carnage.
And unfortunately, we're just not privy to anything. And our big issue, I mean, obviously Hersh is our universe, right? He's our kid, and as everyone listening can picture their own child, and I think that's why we've had such an outpouring of support, is that everyone is very aware that this could be your child. However, what I've been very doggedly trying to explain whenever I'm interviewed, especially in the foreign press, is these are 240 human beings who are buried under Gaza. It is 34 days in. And these are not just Jews, and they are not just Israelis. These are human beings from almost 30 different countries, representing 5 different religions. As you know, ranging in age from 9 months up until 85 years old, spanning the socioeconomic spectrum. These are human beings, and I find it so unbelievably shocking that the International Red Cross is not demanding that they have access to these people, these human beings. I think the whole point, the whole purpose in, I think it was 1862 that the Red Cross was formed, was actually to help when on the battlefield, when people were suffering on the battlefield. That was their charter, was to go help combatants not suffer, even though they were combatants. But the idea that there are children who have been underground for 34 days is so weird to me, that they're not getting involved and making sure these people are seen, or that there's proof of life or anything.
So over the course of these 34 days, as you and the other families have come together under the Bring Them Home campaign, and by the way, we have a whole poster print of that here in the office that we're going to be using at the rally next Tuesday here in Washington, D.C. And we're anything we can do to get this message out, we are doing. Could you tell us a bit about this network, about the Bring Them Home campaign, and maybe as part of that, talk about what are the pressure points you are urging people to exert?
Yeah. So by Saturday afternoon, October 7th, we had a room full of friends over, rolling up their sleeves, on their laptops, whiteboards, putting together a plan of action of what were we going to do to find Hersh. Of course, at that point, we didn't know the magnitude of the situation. Since that time, we've continued to work as a situation room out of our apartment, but also now as part of broader activities connecting to whatever U.S. governmental activities are happening, Israeli governmental activities, and importantly, this amazing distributed volunteer organization called Bring Them Home Now, where they've got people in Israel, people in the U.S. putting out signs, putting out, public awareness, offering financial aid, legal aid, diplomatic aid, all on a voluntary basis. And we've said we're going to continue to drive our own campaign, but also try to be a part of any other campaigns where we could get help, where we could be of help. Hersh, as Rachel said, is our world, but we also say we are fighting for 240 souls right now. If Hersh walks in the house in 20 minutes, we will still be fighting for the other 239, because this is, as Rachel said, a group, global humanitarian issue that nobody else is screaming about, so we need to.
And I'm actually just being handed one of our posters so that you will see that we are actively trying to spread this message. Did we lose you? I see you're frozen again on the screen. I am afraid we have lost them in traffic. We'll give it a minute to see if it reconnects. I know that they are, obviously, as we can all see, they are driving in traffic in Tel Aviv, and so they may need to dial back in again. So we'll give them a minute to reconnect. I think we may have back.
Jeremy,
are we back?
You are back. You are back,
Okay.
and so
Sorry.
suboptimal conditions in a suboptimal period of life.
Exactly. The least of the problems. But I was just showing that we have the posters right here. We're ready to go. We put the link in the chat for the network homepage that you have. So we'll definitely be doing everything we can to spread the word. What are you hearing about the negotiations that are going on right now? There is talk here of a possible 3-day pause that's been offered for the release of some hostages, or is that any information being shared with you about that?
So as a news junkie, it's been interesting It's been interesting for me to be disconnected from the world for the last 34 days. I see headlines and I don't believe any of them. I see Qatar doing this, Iran doing this, Turkey doing this, the US. I see all those. When we see 240 people cross the border, we'll be satisfied.
Totally agree. I totally understand that, but you're not, the State Department and other officials don't keep you directly updated on.
I think they're also really careful because I think that it's understood that there's a lot of mind games being played. So I think they probably don't want to make families, you know, any worse than we are already, you know, suffering.
Yeah. We meet a lot of people. I'm not convinced that we know much more information than you know.
Yeah. Yeah. What in terms of what you were asking when you meet with the Biden administration on the one hand in terms of the US and you meet with the Israeli government, what are the asks? What are the demands from the families, and what specific things are you asking them, each of them, to do?
Every conversation is different, but what we're generally asking everybody is don't forget about, don't forsake the hostages. First of all, in the case of Israel, there's a war going on, and we still make sure that the message is loud and clear that we, the other families, and I think the country is saying there must be a situation where these hostages walk back home, walk back to their families' arms. So that's a message in Israel, but it's even more important around the world and in the US, which is news cycles move quickly. Congressional cycles move quickly. Right now, I don't know. I think the hostage story is still somewhat of a story in the general US world. But if it is, it might not be tomorrow or next week. And the message to the government is don't forget about this. Don't move on from this. Don't give up on this. And the message to the world and the J Street community is don't take your foot off the gas until 240 people walk back into their families' arms.
And by the way, I'll just add, a lot of times people are saying, so what can we do? Which I called because we want to visualize that you literally could do every single day, but that will take you less than a minute, and therefore you will commit to doing it. And so you go to 1 minute a day and you enter your zip code, and it will show you, first of all, your local elected officials, phone numbers or emails, if whatever's easier for you. I personally think calling is very effective and easy, and it's shorter. And we also have the White House comment line and the White House switchboard. And last week I started to say to people, maybe you should just be calling the White House, because we realized we've been tracking it, and we had, you know, between 150,000 and 200,000 people a day calling their local elected officials. And I thought maybe we could pivot, and if the White House is getting 200,000 calls a day saying, hi, it's day 34. And I noticed there are still 240 human beings buried alive under Gaza, and I'm not okay with it. Have a nice day. Now that's 15 seconds. But if everybody's doing that, and we can get those numbers up even higher, if we could get 500,000 calls, 1 million calls as it spreads throughout America, if there are millions of calls a day to the White House saying it's day X, there are still 240 souls buried alive under Gaza, I'm not okay with it. That's 15 seconds. But first of all, you've really added to the noise that the administration that's been wonderful. It's not that they're not being wonderful. It's that they have to understand the concern is going to grow. It's not going to get less. And I also know that for us personally, it takes away a molecule of our anguish, knowing that other people are working with us.
Well, I want to say that anything that we can do to take away that molecule of anguish, believe me, we will do. We will continue to keep Hersh and all 240 human beings, human souls, as you said, at the forefront of what we are doing and the messages we're delivering. And I promise you that in every call that I have with the White House, with the State Department, with senators, members of Congress, there's no issue that comes before the hostages. I guarantee you. And we just appreciate your taking a few minutes out of what I know is just an intense
Thank you for
schedule and sharing your story with us. We will do everything we can. I'm a parent of 2 kids around Hersh's age, and so I couldn't empathize more. It's just beyond belief. And so my heart's with you. All of us will do whatever we can, and we will keep the stories front and center of all of our work.
Thank you, and bring out the J Street Community in force on Tuesday, the 14th.
Right, we'll see you there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right. Safe
Okay, thank you.
driving.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. So before I see that Gershon Baskin has joined us, which is great. And before we continue with that, I just want to take a moment to speak about another one of the hostages who's currently being held by Hamas. And many of you on this call probably have seen her, know her. Maybe you didn't even realize it, but peace activist Vivian Silver, who's a friend of so many in our community, was a speaker at last J Street conference in Washington, D.C. She is a lifelong activist for peace and for equality. You may remember the work that she did if you don't remember her name, which is that she worked with Bedouin communities in the Negev, and she was executive director of an NGO with a series of initials that ends in NISPED, NISPED. And that was devoted to trying to work for integration and equality for the Bedouin community in the Negev and to work on Jewish-Arab cooperation. She was very, very active in Women Wage Peace, which I know a number of our folks have been very supportive. She was a leader in Women Wage Peace, and she was one of the many residents of the South who volunteered on a regular basis to help drive Gazans who were coming out of Gaza to seek medical care. And her organization that she did that with was called Road to Recovery. Vivian is an unbelievable and special person, and so representative of the community of people that were disproportionately affected by October 7th. And I think we've all come to understand that so many of the people in these villages and communities in the Gaza envelope area are among the more peace-loving and peace-seeking and coexistence-seeking peoples within the state of Israel. And the horror that this is the set of communities that were impacted, communities that many of you have visited with me. We have walked down these streets. We've been in Vivian's home. We've been in so many other homes. And I just want to take a moment to recognize Vivian, to say that we are waiting for, praying for, hoping for your safe return. And as I promised Hersh's parents, we will do everything we can to continue to fight for a better future in your honor, because that's what you devoted your life to, and we will devote ours, a better life and a better future for Israelis and Palestinians. So with that, Gershon, I want to invite you to join us and turn the camera on if you can. Not sure if Gershon, I see that you've unmuted.
I turned on my camera too, but it's not going on, which is very strange. Is it controlled by you guys? Should I go out and restart my Zoom?
Interesting.
My Zoom was working all day. I may have to reboot my computer, which will take 2 minutes.
So try turning on and off one more time the camera, see if that does anything.
No, not doing it.
Not doing it.
I've used the Zoom about 10 times today already. So why don't I do a quick restart?
All right, we will be here. We are waiting for
Okay.
your
All right. Sorry about this.
Sure. So my apologies to folks. I hope you'll hang in there with us. I think that there is a lot to be learned and gained from the experience of Gershon Baskin. I'll go ahead and just give you his biography, and hopefully in the course of that period of time, he will dial back in. So Dr. Gershon Baskin is a former Israeli hostage negotiator, as well as, again, an Israeli-Palestinian peace activist, and he's a policy expert. He helped lead the negotiations that I think he is most known for the release of Gilad Shalit, who is the Israeli soldier who was held captive by Hamas for 5 years. Gershon's name is well known in the circles of Middle East peacemakers and peace seekers. You probably all do recognize his name. The columns that he writes in the Jerusalem Post and that he circulates by email are extraordinarily thoughtful, thought-provoking. He's been an advisor to Israeli and Palestinian and other countries, prime ministers and political leaders. He's served as the Middle East director of the International Communities Organization, which is a human rights advocacy group. He's been director of the Holy Land Bond, which is an investment fund aimed at supporting Israeli-Palestinian coexistence. I knew him in his days at IPCRI back in the late 90s, and some of you probably know him there as well, from there as well. And when he comes back, I won't need to read him his own biography. So that is a good use of time. I will take a second to just comment as well on the rally, which is on Tuesday here in Washington, D.C. It's Tuesday, November 14th, and J Street is not a formal sponsor of the rally. We and other independent groups were not invited to add our names to the rally, but we do hope that there will be a good presence of those of us who both support the people of Israel, who support the hostage families, who believe in the state of Israel, and just want to show our solidarity at a very difficult time. And so we will have a group there. We're understanding that the nuanced messages that J Street likes to convey and for which we are known will not be the messages necessarily heard from the stage, but we do think we want to be part of the very broad community that will be in Washington on November 14th to express our support for the state and the people of Israel. So Gershon, I see that you have signed back in. It appears it isn't working. So we're just going to go ahead and do this by audio, I think.
I'm going to go into my Skype on my telephone.
So while you're doing that, I don't want to lose too much more time, though. If we can, while you're multitasking with the technology, I might, start to ask you a few questions as well, if that's okay. So you'll be happy to know that while you were reconnecting, I read your bio so that you don't have to listen to your bio. So folks on the call are aware. And I think most people on this call probably on this Zoom already knew you to begin with. You're obviously best known for the back channel.
Okay.
Another one. There you go. And you just disconnect if you don't disconnect the other one.
That's what I'm doing. Okay.
Oh, all right. Good to see you.
You too, Jeremy.
Yes. So I wanted to start with your take on the current situation. Obviously, this is simply unprecedented, right? I mean, it is a scale and a horror unimaginable, and here we are, and we would really love to hear your take on the complications, the considerations, what goes into the thinking around how to go about trying to secure the release of a march.
So I'll get right into it and talk about where we are now rather than what's happened over the past month, which is much less interesting and important. Right now, there are 3 tracks of negotiations going on that we all know about. There's the Qatari track, the Egyptian track, and the Lebanese track. For some reason that escapes me, the United States and Israel are putting most of their weight into the Qatari track. The Hamas leadership is sitting, the Hamas exiled leadership is sitting in Qatar. The most interesting person who's there is actually someone named Khalil Haya, who is the deputy of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader in Gaza. And for reasons that probably are connected to the Hamas's plans on October 7th, he was not in Gaza on October 7th, and he is in Doha, in Qatar. He was today, together with Ismail Haniya, in Egypt, meeting with Abbas Kamel, who's the head of the Egyptian intelligence. And this was interesting because as of yesterday, to the best of my knowledge, there was no coordination between the Egyptians and the Qataris on the negotiations. The track of the Qatari is being led by the head of the Mossad, Dedi Barnea, from the Israeli side. So it's way, way up at the top in terms of the importance and the probability that something might happen there. The track with the Egyptians is being led by the head of the Shabak, Ronen Bar. The third track that was opened up was actually the initiative of Amos Hochstein, who you probably all know. Amos is an American Jewish Israeli he was appointed by President Obama to be in charge of Power Africa, bringing solar energy to the African continent. He's an energy person, but he was the primary negotiator in setting the sea border between the state of Israel and Lebanon. And during the course of those negotiations, he became very close with a man named Abbas Ibrahim, who's the head of the Central Intelligence in Lebanon. He's actually now retired, but Abbas Ibrahim is very well connected to Hezbollah and to Hamas and to Iranians and everyone else in the region. And Amos went to Abbas Ibrahim and asked him to get involved in the negotiations. And that track has been going on as well. Abbas Ibrahim traveled to Doha a few days ago. So things seem to be centered on Doha, although my experience and my knowledge tells me that there's a misconnect between the Hamas leadership that's in Qatar and the underground leadership in Gaza, where the decisions need to be made. There is no digital communication whatsoever within the command of Hamas in the tunnels. They're using all analog communications and landlines and primitive passing messages from one person to another. So the distance between Qatar and Gaza is quite big. The Egyptians, on the other hand, have a direct line to the military wing of Hamas. That's been proven over the years. It was always the Egyptians who negotiated ceasefires with Hamas. And if we recall, the first two women who were released, the Ra'anan women from Chicago, were released through the Qatari efforts at direct pressure of President Biden and Secretary Blinken, who even mentioned them by name to the Qataris. But a few days later, the Egyptians released another two women who were not dual citizens of any country. They were only Israeli. What was really interesting was that the Hamas military spokesperson, Abu Ubaida, put out in the Hamas movement's Telegram page that in an hour we will be releasing these two women, and they gave their names. One of them, they messed up on the name, but they gave their Israeli ID numbers as well. When that happened, I contacted the people I know in Hamas who are both in Gaza, in Beirut, and in Doha, and they didn't know anything about this planned release. They knew nothing. The release said that the mediation was done by Qatar and Egypt, and 20 minutes later, they put out a correction saying the mediation was only done by Egypt. The night before, at 12:30 at night, the Egyptian intelligence officer in the embassy in Tel Aviv called me and asked me for the phone number of the head of the Office of the International Red Cross in Tel Aviv. It took me about 10 minutes to find the name of the current director and her phone number, and I gave it to him. The next day, this release happened. They were released by Ezzedin al-Qassam soldiers, people from the military wing of Hamas. My understanding from that night, and I verified the next morning, that he took the phone number from me because they were coordinating the release of these two women. This was a competition between Egypt and Qatar. Israel had nothing to do with it whatsoever. The United States was not involved in it whatsoever. It was clearly the Egyptians showing we can do a better job. which is interesting today because of the visit of Ismail Haniyeh and Khalil Haya to Egypt, where they met with Abbas Kamil. Now, I met 2 days ago with the Egyptian intelligence officer, who told me that 5 days ago, this would be now 6 or 7, a week ago, they were expecting to receive from Hamas a list of the women, children, and elderly that Hamas was willing to release in exchange for a ceasefire. And then the Israeli army surrounded Gaza City and entered Gaza City. And the intelligence officer in the Egyptian embassy told me that Hamas then froze the process, didn't deliver the list, and said that they weren't going to until there was a ceasefire. The difficulty now of a ceasefire is that Israeli troops are embedded in the center of Gaza. They're surrounding Gaza, they're inside Gaza. A 3-day ceasefire, which Hamas is asking for, leaves the Israeli army as sitting ducks. There cannot be a ceasefire without a redeployment to safer positions. And that's a big operation. It's not so simple to just declare a ceasefire and the Israelis stop shooting, because there's no guarantee that Hamas will stop shooting, and the Israelis are in very vulnerable positions now. So the rumors that came out last night that there's a deal cooking for 10 or 15 hostages is part of negotiations. It's the psychological warfare. It's not real. Israel is not going to give a ceasefire without a substantial release. When I say substantial, I mean the women, the children, and the elderly. Hamas does not include the women soldiers within the women category. They are being held separately. They will be kept separately in the category of soldiers. There is literally, in my estimation, a matter of days before the possible negotiation is no longer there. Excuse me, sorry. The Israeli army is encroaching deeply into Gaza. They are uncovering tunnels. They are making the plans for how rescue operations will be done. Every rescue operation is a chance for a miracle, but it's also extremely risky to the safety of the hostages and, to, of course, to the safety of the Israeli soldiers. We can be sure that the Israelis have been working on detailed planning with technology and scanning and all kinds of mechanisms to not have to send soldiers blindly into these tunnels. But we can be sure that a good number of those hostages are being held in tunnels, and they will be between the Israeli army and whoever's holding them on the other side. I believe that after a month, Hamas is fully in control, even though this evening the Islamic Jihad released a video of 2 hostages, a woman and a child. I haven't seen it yet because I was in Arabic class, but it's on my phone. I'm sure you'll all have access to it soon. It's been released and it's in the media now. But I'm sure that Hamas has full control over all the hostages and can negotiate on behalf of all the hostages. It's just a question now of whether or not a deal can be made. I'll conclude with just this. The only way of bringing back all the hostages is through a negotiated deal. The only way to bring them back home safely. And I'll caveat that by saying we don't know how many of them are alive. We don't know how many are wounded. We don't know what their condition is. There are infants there. There are elderly people. There are people who need insulin because they have diabetes and other illnesses. And we don't know how many of them are alive. We don't know how many have been killed, perhaps by Israeli bombing in Gaza. But the only way to bring them all back is through a negotiated deal. The only deal possible is the all for all deal, all the hostages for all the prisoners in Israel. Here we're talking about 7,000 Palestinian prisoners. Of 559 of them have murdered Israelis. These are big terrorists, including many who have murdered many Israelis. Another 130 terrorists who were caught inside of Israel after October 7th. About 30% of the prisoners are from Hamas. Only about 400 of the prisoners are from Gaza. The overwhelming majority are from the West Bank. About 2,000 of the prisoners are administrative detainees, meaning that they've been arrested without charge and imprisoned without trial. 43 of the prisoners, at least before October 7th, were women. 190 of the prisoners were minors under the age of 18. That's the bulk of the prisoners. The only way to bring all the hostages back is a deal like that. Why would Hamas do it? Because Yahya Sinwar and his colleagues made a promise the day they left prison in the Shalit deal that they would free all the hostages. Sinwar is not afraid to die. He will not surrender. The leadership of Hamas will not escape through tunnels to Egypt or anyone else. They will fight to the end. They will be killed by Israel. And they still want the major achievement to be not only bringing the Palestinian issue back to the international agenda, but freeing the prisoners. Can Israel free the prisoners? That's a very big question. I've had this talk with a number of security people in Israel who said, we can free the 559 and 130 terrorists into Gaza, and we will get them. Most people don't know this, but anyone who touched Gilad Shalit is no longer alive. Not the people who watched him, not the people who took him, not the people who were responsible for him. Israel got all of them. And Israel believes it can get all the prisoners that would be released also. This is a horrible scenario to think of. Many of the people who are prisoners are not terrorists. Some are arrested because they belong to a terrorist organization, the PFLP or Fatah or whatever. But I don't think the current government of Israel is able to make a deal of all for all. I don't think it's possible. I think that Netanyahu is too weak to be able to get a deal like that through the government. And there are people in his government like Smotrich and Ben Gvir who said from day one, we have to sacrifice the hostages in order to achieve the larger military mission of dismantling Hamas.
Do you think that I mean, in your opinion, is that a deal that should be taken?
If Israel decided or decides to sacrifice the hostages, this is the kind of blow to Israeli society that I don't know how we heal from. If that's the assessment that will be made in the coming days, that we will try to rescue whoever we can, but we're also willing to sacrifice them, I think the solidarity that has existed in Israeli society, even during the bad times, even during the 40 weeks of protest, when we were more divided than ever, there was a sense of solidarity in Israel and the knowledge known that if we had to be enlisted to save the country, we would. And everyone, I think that's one of the special things about Israeli society. If the government decides to sacrifice the hostages, I don't know how that solidarity, that sense of who we are as Israelis would ever come back. It would be a generation, 2 generations, and I think it would break the soul of this country. And yet, I don't think it's a deal that can be made. I just don't think that anyone in the government would accept it and push it through. It's giving Hamas a reward at the same time that we are dedicated to their destruction. And I don't think that we have the ability to hand them a victory, even if every single one of those Hamas leaders are going to be killed the week later or 2 weeks later or a month from now. It's just the kind of thing that is existential in a way to who we are as a country. So I think that there is still a chance for the humanitarian release. That means that even under the best circumstances of bringing out all the women, all the children, and all the elderly, the sick and the wounded, there are still going to be 60, 70, 80 soldiers left behind that there won't be a negotiated deal for, because that will be the release of all the prisoners. And Israel will simply have to go in and find them and try to rescue them, whatever the costs are.
Yeah. I mean, this is a choice that has no answer. These are just irreconcilable choices that one should never have to face, that we're facing right now.
That's right.
I wanted to probe a little bit on your relationship over the years with Hamas, and obviously I think we've all seen and read your open letter to the Deputy Foreign Minister Ghazi Hamad, and if you don't mind, I will just quote briefly, and you can then tell the story a little bit about your relationship with him and where you think we stand these days in terms of thinking about Hamas in the future. You said, and I quote, "Honestly, Ghazi, you surprised me and disappointed me. We've known each other for 18 years. We've spoken more than 1,000 times, and we've met face to face, I think, 4 times. You earned my respect when you showed that you actually cared for Gilad Shalit and wanted him to return to his family, not just to get prisoners released. There was some humanity in you. And on the day of his release, you even said to me, next time we will negotiate peace. This is what you said, but you have changed and you are evil." It was such a powerful piece to read. And I know, just how deeply this must have, rocked your world who have written that. And I'm wondering if you could sort of share where you're at on that. And, what does this mean for thinking about this quote unquote, this goal of dismantling Hamas, or how do you deal with Hamas in the future? I'd love your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, my first phone call with Ghazi Hamad was the week after Gilad Shalit was abducted, through a professor of economics from the Islamic University in Gaza that I met at a conference, a World Bank conference in Cairo. And we developed a relationship and actually tried to create a formal dialogue between Israelis and Hamas people that in the end never happened because the Hamas leadership vetoed it. On the 7th day after Gilad was abducted, this professor called me and said, "We have to do something." I said, "What can we do?" He said, "Let's open up a channel of communication." He went to the Hamas prime minister's office and they called me. And later in that day, early in the morning, actually, I spoke to Ghazi Hamad for the first time. I didn't know who he was. I knew that he was the spokesperson of Hamas and the advisor to the prime minister. And he surprised me twice in that phone call. He spoke to me in Hebrew. And I said to him, I felt uncomfortable with him speaking to me in Hebrew. I said, "You can speak English or Arabic if you want." And he responded to me, "I like speaking Hebrew." Later, I learned that he learned Hebrew when he was in prison in Israel, but he liked speaking Hebrew. And then I'm standing in my kitchen looking at my 2 sons who are pre-army age, and he suggests that we organize a phone call with the soldier's father. And here I am in my kitchen looking at my 2 boys who in a few years are going to be soldiers, thinking about the possibility that one of them could be held in captivity in Gaza, and thought to myself, this is a really humane gesture. I spoke to Noam Shalit, may rest in peace. Later in that day, it took me a few hours to find his phone call and ask him and his wife Aviva, Gilad's mother, if they were ready to talk to someone from Hamas. And they said, of course, we want to know where our son is, what his condition is, what they want for his release. And later that day, the phone call took place with Ghazi Hamad and Noam Shalit. The next day, Aviva and Noam came to Jerusalem and I met them the first time. And I told them that I would be with them until the day that Gilad comes home. And my relationship with Ghazi continued. He was the most intensive interlocutor that I had with Hamas over all these years. And I've met many different Hamas people, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. But he was the main interlocutor. And it was through this connection that 2.5 months after Gilad was abducted, after going to Gaza twice, I secured a handwritten letter from Gilad Shalit that was delivered to the Egyptians in Gaza, and it was through the work of Ghazi Hamad. 5 years later, the Israeli government Netanyahu decided to accept the idea of a secret direct back channel between Israel and Hamas, and that was me and Ghazi Hamad. And we spent the months of May, June, and July negotiating a document of principles. I was working under the guidance of the Mossad officer David Meidan, and Ghazi was in direct contact with Ahmed Jabri, who was the head of the Hamas's military forces and the person holding Shalit and responsible for him. So we negotiated a deal. It took 7 versions of a paper that we worked on, and in the end, the 7th version was actually written in over a 2-hour conversation we had one night when I told him we have to stop this back and forth of the ping pong, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and let's do something that negotiators who trust each other actually do. You put all your cards on the table and you agree on the midpoint. And that's what we did over a 2-hour period. He put Hamas's positions, I put Israeli positions on the table, and we wrote a document that the next day David Meidan took to Netanyahu to get a green light to finish the deal. It took another few months because there was Ramadan and Jewish holidays and a terrorist attack, but that was the breakthrough. And it was done because of the trust that developed between us. Immediately after Gilad came home, Razi and I started negotiating a long-term ceasefire, what they call a hutna. And we went through a number of versions of the document. The final version that I was working on, I took to show Ehud Barak, who was Minister of Defense, and I took to show the representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations, because there's a role for UN troops in verification of the agreement that we had worked on. And on the morning that Razi delivered it to Ahmed Jabari, Israel assassinated Jabari. And that was the end of that process. Razi and I continue to be in contact. After 2014, there were 2 Israeli soldiers killed in Gaza whose bodies were abducted by Hamas. And then about a year later, a year and a half later, it became known to the Israeli public that there are 2 Israeli civilians who were both not mentally well, who both went into Gaza on their own and were taken by Hamas and held by Hamas, an Ethiopian, Avera Mengistu, and a Bedouin Israeli named Hisham Sayed. And over the last 8 years, I was negotiating on and off, officially, unofficially, under the supervision of the coordinator for missing people in the Israeli Ministry of Defense, trying to negotiate the release of the 2 bodies and the 2 Israeli civilians. And my main interlocutor throughout that time was Razi Hamad, of course. So we have spent 17 years or so negotiating. In the summer of 2021, I proposed to Razi, when we reached a deadlock in those negotiations, that we try and expand the discussion and go back to the paper we worked on in 2012. And I proposed to him that we spend a few days together. I thought we could do it either in Norway or Switzerland, which are 2 countries which don't list Hamas as terrorist countries. They're neutral on the issue of Hamas. And I arranged for us to go to Norway, talking to the Norwegian ambassador. The Norwegian sent someone to Razi to talk to him, to make sure that he was in, and they were going to prepare the visa for him. And Razi got scared off and canceled the trip. I made arrangements for us to go to Switzerland, and I thought I got him an invitation from an NGO, a Swiss NGO, and the Swiss government was going to issue a national visa to him. And by that time, Razi had backed out of it. And I think from looking back, he was already in the know that some big military operation was in the planning. Over the last months, I had been talking to him about meeting in Cairo for a few days, until about a month before the war, he said to me, I can't go. I didn't know at this point that he wasn't even in Gaza anymore. Starting from the second day of the war, I was in contact with him to try and put together a deal for, we didn't know how many hostages there were, but I knew that there were 43 women in prison and 190 youth. And I said to him, why don't we do a deal where you guys will release the women, the children, the elderly, the sick, and the wounded, and we will release the women and the minors from prison. I was already talking to, at this point, people who had just been appointed to the cabinet from Gantz's party, and got signals that they would be willing to get the other members of the war cabinet to agree to a deal like this. And I thought we should do it very early on. I knew that we had to involve the Qataris and the Egyptians, so the Qatari emissary who had been going back and forth between Israel and Egypt and Gaza, the one who was carrying the suitcases of money, is a guy named Mohammed El-Imadi, and I've been in touch with him for years. He was the official emissary, but his contact in Israel was the head of Koyat, the coordinator of government activities in the territories, who's a general in an army uniform, a Druze officer, but he's not at the level for negotiating. So myself and John Linden from ALMEP, who sits in Paris, were coordinating with the Qataris, trying to put them in direct contact with the Israelis. At that time, Secretary Blinken showed up in Doha and left one of his hostage experts in Doha. And I thought that complicated the mix, because the Qataris were talking to the Americans, who were then talking to the Israelis, who were then talking back to the Americans, and we wanted to cut it short. So we made sure to give the Qataris the phone numbers of ministers from the Israeli government, and gave the ministers in the government the phone number of the deputy foreign minister in Qatar. In the same time, we were trying to push the Egyptian channel with the Egyptian intelligence, just trying to cut the channels and make it smoother. Then a few days later, I get a call from someone who I haven't seen since 2005, a guy named Abdul Munum Abu Sardana, who was Arafat's advisor on Hamas. This is a guy who actually had seen the terrorist, the arch terrorist, the engineer Yahya Ash. He met him in Gaza before Israel assassinated him. And he was very close to Arafat. His father, Abdul Munim's father, was one of the most important sheikhs in Gaza. I hadn't spoken to him in years. He called me and said, "Hey, I just spoke to your friend." I said, "Who's my friend?" He says, "Ghazi Hamid." He said, "You know he's in Beirut?" And I was shocked because on the third night of the war, Israel bombed his house. And I contacted him and he answered. So I was relieved to know that he was alive. And I asked him, "Was your house bombed?" And he said, "Yes." I asked him how his family was, and he didn't say anything. We went on to talk about a possible deal. And afterwards, when I discovered that he was in Beirut and his family was in Beirut with him, everything sort of fell in place. And then it was very clear that he was the spokesperson for Hamas for this war. He is the primary person appearing on television, in the media, in the Arab world, and in the Western media. There was that famous BBC interview where he walked out. And Ghazi, in our first conversations, they were very tough. I mean, I told him, "Do you realize that you crossed a line? You did things that are taken out of the ISIS handbook. This is not Hamas, and you guys are no longer," I said to him, "you guys are no longer worthy of ruling Gaza. You don't realize it, but your days are numbered. If the Israelis went after you, Ghazi Hamid, the person who is responsible in Hamas for Gilad Shalit being alive, you're targeted, and everyone in Hamas is targeted." And he, of course, changed his tone and said, "We're not afraid to die, and we will fight to the death, and we will kill a lot of you Israelis." And the whole tone of our conversation was very different from what it had been in 17 years. And then there was that interview he gave in Arabic, where he stopped denying what they did, because at the beginning he said, "We didn't do it. It wasn't us. We didn't kill those babies. We didn't burn whole families alive." And then he not only admitted it, he said, "We're going to do it again and again and again, and Israel has to be annihilated, and Israel has no right to live." And at that point is when I wrote that letter to him. And as I read that letter over and over again to myself, I said, "I want this to be public. It's important to know that the person that the world had engaged with, anyone in the international community who tried to engage with Hamas, Ghazi Hamid was the person they engaged with. And if Ghazi Hamid is now representing this organization, this movement, this monster, then it's very clear that the Israeli primary military mission to make sure that Hamas never rules Gaza again is real and justified and has to be done."
Well, Gershon, we have reached the top of the hour. I could listen for another hour for sure. I know, though, we promised people that we would keep them to under the hour. Hopefully, this isn't the last time we'll be speaking in the next few weeks, and perhaps we can get you back on for another conversation and sort of see where things are.
Hopefully with some good news.
Hopefully with some good news, and hopefully with your computer back up and running as well.
Right.
But Gershon, I just want to say thank you on behalf of J Street for all that you do and all you have done in trying to work, as we all do, for a world that is better than the world that we are currently in. And we know the work is hard. We know it's an uphill struggle, but if anybody has had the strength and the endurance to keep on going, it's you. And I just want to say thank you for that. Thank you for joining us today, for all of your work and your insights. And I want to say thank you to all the J Street folks who are with us and stuck with us for the hour. And we will see you in our next webinar and in other community meetings in the weeks and months ahead. So thanks again, Gershon.
I also want to say thank you to you and to J Street for the wonderful work you're doing. Your presence in the United States is essential, and your voice has to get stronger and louder every day.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate it. Take care. Be safe.